Welcome, everybody. I guess we'll go ahead and get started on time. And my name is John Donnelly, and I'm a reporter for Congressional Quarterly, cover defense issues, and I'm the chairman of the National Press Club Press Freedom Committee. And I'd like to welcome you to the National Press Club, the world's leading professional organization for journalists. The Press Freedom Committee of the Press Club spearheads the club's efforts to speak out for press freedom and transparency and to speak against repression of the media wherever it occurs. And I emphasize that because I've seen a few suggestions on Twitter in the last few days, just as I tried to promote this event, that somehow tonight's event is picking on Turkey and exempting from criticism the United States or Israel. In fact, Turkish President Erdogan criticized Reporters Without Borders on similar grounds last year. Baseless. We at the National Press Club don't play favorites. We target America's shortcomings too. And you can see for yourself by going to our website, press.org, and looking at our press freedom page. A member of NATO and ostensibly a democracy, but it has a bad track record in human rights. And when it comes to press freedom, independent monitors, such as the Reporters Without Borders and the Committee to Protect Journalists, say Turkey has been getting worse in recent years. The Reporters Without Borders ranked Turkey number 154 out of 180 countries in its 2014 Press Freedom Index. In 2014, Reporters Without Borders documented 117 incidents of attacks and threats against journalists in Turkey. In 2012 and 2013, the Erdogan government had more journalists imprisoned than any other country in the world, more than China, more than Iran. In 2013, we at the National Press Club gave our annual Press Freedom Award to one of those jailed journalists, Zeynep Kure of the Istanbul Daily Burgun. Now, there aren't as many reporters in jail this year in Turkey, but there are too many reporters in jail in Turkey. As recently as mid-December, the government of President Erdogan ordered the arrest of more than 31 people, including a large number of journalists and senior managers affiliated with media outlets supportive of Erdogan's rival, the US-based Islamic cleric Fethullah Gulen. Turkey also censors social media. It shut down Twitter for a couple of weeks last year. Twitter has agreed to block access in Turkey to many accounts and tweets, although those are available outside of Turkey. And just yesterday we learned that Facebook agreed to block a page in Turkey that the government said was critical of the Prophet Muhammad. Turkey's Prime Minister said in the Washington Post in an interview published on Sunday that there is no right to insult Islam. No one here wants to insult Islam, but we defend the right of news organizations to determine what's in poor taste and what's insulting, because we believe that when governments are allowed to make those decisions for newspapers, it's easier for governments to repress all kinds of expression.
I would like to refer to only two cases, and I think they are very sad cases. One of them involves a young lady called Sedef Kabash, who happens to have been a student of mine, a very bright media person who studied here in the US too, worked for CNN here, and then subsequently in Turkey. And now she is under an investigation for a Twitter she has sent out about the prosecutor that concluded there was no case as far as the corruption allegations involving some of the political leadership. The second example is Merve Büyüksaraç. This is really a sadder case because this is Miss Turkey. And Miss Turkey happened to come across a poem that takes a satirical perspective on the Turkish national anthem and the president of Turkey. And when she was warned by a friend of hers that this could cause her trouble, she immediately withdrew. But that was too late, and she was detained. And I understand subsequently freed. I suspect and I speculate that these two young ladies will eventually be let go. But in early this month, the Hürriyet newspaper ran the results of a public opinion survey that included 16,000 people. And one of the many questions that was asked was whether you considered that the media and the internet could be censored. And I'm afraid 60% said the media could be censored, and 61% said that the internet could be censored. So we are facing, unfortunately, a society that, in spite of Turkey setting out on the road of democracy in 1946, we have not arrived to the point where Hasan Salame would like us to be in. Last point I'd like to make is that also as an observer of Turkish politics for the period I've made references to, I must also recognize that today when you survey to the Turkish media, there is a lot of critical opinion out there. And some of it is penned in a manner, if I was targeted, I would take offense of it. But the pool of those people are very quickly shrinking, as many face this harassment or end up being ostracized. Some very prominent journalists of high standing and long standing have been victims of this ostracization. And I feel deeply concerned about this because the current government has on numerous occasions set a very high target for Turkey to become the 10th largest economy in the world by 2023, when the Republic's centenary will be celebrated. And I can't help wonder how we're going to get there if critical thinking is silenced.
Delphine Halgan with Reporters Without Borders. Tell us a little bit about how they see the situation in Turkey.
So just to finish on your last comment that I have to say I agree on, I just want, it's obvious to me that I'm afraid that Fox News in the US has a huge market and can make huge mistakes when reporting on France. So I just had to make this university. I just wanted maybe to make three different comments on three different aspects of this crackdown. So first, the one that we already mentioned, the internet censorship, which is becoming more and more important with more and more legal attempts to legalize the fact that the authorities can block website without court decision. There's actually a judicial fight going on between the Constitutional Court and the Parliament, but we have seen that there's more and more legal attempts to reinforce the power of the government to block website. And we have seen that this year when Twitter was blocked, YouTube was blocked as well for 2 months. And I'm afraid that it will continue because there's now a strong attempt to legalize this internet censorship in a sense. But there's this clear internet censorship aspect of it, but there's, I think, more and more direct censorship, if we can say. We have seen in these last 2 years more and more frequent gag orders. So the interdiction for journalists to cover different issues. You remember certainly when 80 Turkish citizens have been abducted by ISIS. There was a ban to cover this issue, but also on the alleged arms convoy to Syria, and also on the corruption scandal. 70 journalists have been prosecuted for covering this issue. And if we want to go to how also journalists and media have been more and more controlled, I really have to highlight the fact that we have seen this year that many journalists from different newspaper and sometimes very famous one have been fired. We heard in the context of this corruption scandal many proof that many media receive direct pressure from the government to cover events in a certain way.
I'm going to try to give a perspective from Washington, as John said. There's no, I'm free, but there are some limits for the speakers. So, and I will try to give this kind of perspective in terms of what is press freedom and what we are expecting as journalists from the government and what we are suffering. The example that Kemal Hoca gave is very striking, actually, and it's summarizing the question, the problem in Turkey. We have also the problem in terms of the notion of press freedom in Turkey. Some people, for example, some provocative journalists can define the press freedom in a different way. For example, in RT example that you gave recently, it was Jill Dougherty who asked us that question this morning. And he was the foreign affairs correspondent for CNN for years. And she provoked Nuland, and Nuland said no. So it doesn't mean that she was believing the shutdown of RT, but Nuland rejected her, and he rejected her provocation, and no, it's the press freedom issue, she said. This is exactly the press freedom, I think. The journalists are always trying to provoke the government people, and what the government people should do in terms of this kind of provocation attempt, they have to be in the limits. They have to be, I mean, you are the government and this is the press, there's a conflict of interest, and you cannot shut down a media outlet, and also you cannot criticize a journalist because of the question that she asked. This is the press freedom, I mean, the definition, I think, the perfect definition. But the problem, even the journalists in Turkey do not believe that this definition, I think, and most of them in Turkey, because we have opinions, and sometimes this opinion clashes. I mean, we are debating on specific issue, let's say, and sometimes the other journalists can argue that you cannot defend that opinion. You cannot say that you are not. This is not journalism that you are doing. This is the journalists who are doing this. A couple of months ago, there was a panel here. I was invited again by the National Press Club, and James Risen was sitting next to me, actually, in that panel, and I was complaining about the press freedom issues in Turkey, and then he was complaining about the press freedom problems in the U.S. And what he said, maybe you remember recently that yesterday a court in Alexandria gave a verdict about the source of James Risen, that even James Risen didn't testify against him. They jailed the ex-intelligence officer.
Convicting him. We're waiting for his sentence.
Yes, and yes, he's probably in April 24 he will be going to jail. Anyway, we will see. But they threatened James Risen to testify for his source, and he rejected that, and he said that no, I cannot reveal my source. If you want, you can put me on jail. And then the court stepped back, and with no any evidence. Probably you are expert on this, but as far as I read, there is no any concrete evidence describing the relationship between this source and the James Risen, but even though they sentenced him. And James Risen was complaining about this situation, this pressure coming from the government. So there are different type of the pressures coming from the governments in terms of the press freedom. This is the problem in US maybe, but the worst part in Turkey, we have also this kind of problem. The government are sometimes threatening the journalists to reveal their source, cover a specific issue, like Syria issue, like the convoy that you mentioned, that hostage crisis, because of the court decisions. So it's not about only the government, it's also the judicial system problem. The tradition in the State Department, when they conducted this kind of press conference at the 7th floor, this is always the journalists, American journalists, who pick the journalists who will ask the question during the conference. So, for example, if they can make an agreement with the counterparts, and they can say we're going to take two questions for US media and the 2 questions for the guest. And each time, the American media decide who will ask this question from the bullpen, from the journalists who are working in the State Department. But in that meeting, Turks decided by themselves, the government. I mean. American journalists decided who will ask the question, the journalists by themselves, and the government, Turkish government, decided by themselves. I mean, they didn't ask even to the journalists. And no one was bothered from this front. Even the guy who asked this question. So this is the mentality that I'm complaining about, the press freedom issues in Turkey. So what we have to do, maybe, I mean, sometimes, okay, they are doing the self-criticism too. I mean, I don't want to mention, you touch upon the Gulen movement issue too, I mean, very, in a proper way. There are some of them are doing self-criticism on this kind of attitude too, but in the long run, what we have to do, we have to probably accept the universal definition of press freedom without any ideological tendency, and we have to obey the universal judicial system rules in terms of protecting constitutional rules, protecting the press freedom. So that's the way that.
Thank you for showing up despite the snow. As a young person who wanted a liberal democratic Turkey going towards European Union, Brussels, getting rid of the minority authoritarianism in Turkey, I just thought that Erdogan was taking us in the right direction. After all, they implemented unprecedented EU reforms, provided again, especially religious freedoms for the larger community in Turkey. And in such a background, I was critical myself of people who were blaming Erdogan of being an Islamofascist, taking Turkey towards Islamofascism, because I just thought that we did not have enough evidence of such a trend. Because after all, actions speak louder than those words. And yes, this guy and this party had Islamist backgrounds and the sort of a different identity. Yes, he said that in the past, that democracy is like a training. It's a tool. It's not an objective in and of itself. I just believe that he has changed. So 10 years after such criticisms and blames of mind reading on the parts of others who were critical of Erdogan, with great disappointment, I have to admit that they turned out to be right. Today, I call what we have been witnessing in Turkey, the name of the regime in Turkey, arbitrocracy. I don't know whether Google says that, nobody else uses it, so I can take the credit, I guess.
Arbitrocracy.
Arbitrocracy.
Is it arbitrary?
Arbitrary, because everything takes place. I'm not going to argue that Turkey was a fully democratic, consolidated democracy in the past. But for a while, we sort of had a dream. I just thought that we were going, finally, we made a U-turn. We were going towards the EU. Despite everything, we were liberalizing slowly, moving towards the European Union. But unfortunately, with growing powers, unchecked and uncontrolled growing powers, growing control over media, establishing his own media empire, I argue with 100% confidence that Erdogan is the largest media boss in Turkey today, directly or indirectly. We could discuss this in detail. I'm sure everybody who has been following Turkey closely are aware of, unless they are benefiting from being a loyalist of Erdogan's system, they should, and unless they haven't killed their conscience, they should admit that he is the biggest media boss in Turkey. Yes, in this, so we have been witnessing a one-man show, but of course, jailed journalists has always been a critical problem in Turkey. But I agree with my colleague and Professor Kirsch that we should not reduce this problem into jailed journalists, because looking at the media issues in Turkey from that angle would be extremely misleading. More than that, we have been every single day, we have been witnessing intimidation, harassment, smear campaigns, and this is not limited to our media group, Zaman media group. I want to give specific examples of course, the our media group Zaman has been the direct and largest, biggest target of the not only the government Erdogan but his hitman in the media who has been employed in the pro-government or Erdogan-controlled media. Of course, Dumanlı and Karaca cases are dramatic. But as in addition to Sedef Kabaş, for example, an independent journalist, I guess I sometimes believe that it's easier to target women, because when I look at the examples, there are so many women, young women, who have been targeted directly by politicians. This is so asymmetrical. For example, Amberin Zaman, and the correspondent for The Economist, and also who is a columnist for Taraf. Several times, many politicians targeted her, and once Erdogan, in the rallies, I guess, as far as I remember, he called her despicable woman. And of course, when a politician calls a young female journalist a despicable woman, his supporters and followers follow suit. Even personally, as I speak here as a journalist representing, Zaman Media Group here, although I would like to emphasize that these are my, of course, personal views. I'm in no position to represent these movement, even though I share the same worldview with to a great extent with them. I experience similar examples of harassment and attacks every single day. Even as I spoke, for example, this morning we had a talk in the Congress. And following ours, after, I just retweeted some of the comments and some notifications that we held a speech about media freedoms in Turkey. I cannot tell you how many accusations I received blaming me, labeling me traitor. Because in today's Turkey, thanks to Erdogan and his huge propaganda machine, media controlled by him, unfortunately today any dissidence is labeled treason. That's even more worrying than jailing journalists, because even if you are not jailed, even if you are, technically free, you do not feel free, because you are subject to endless attacks, smear campaigns, harassments of pro-government circles in Turkey, in Twitter, in conventional media, by lies and slanders. Of course, compared to what my colleagues have gone through, this is not comparable, as it has become ordinary, because persecution of journalists, targeting of journalists in Turkey has become a rule rather than an exception. I was in California doing some research in the Silicon Valley, thanks to a grant by Holding Center, a DC-based think tank, which has an office in DC. They are supporting journalists as well. So during my research there, and it was a good break from Turkey's craziness actually, and I enjoyed it, I learned that, and one of my colleagues emailed me, "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that Davutoğlu, the current prime minister, who is a professor and who is supposed to understand the basics of democracy, he sued me, and he filed a legal complaint against me due to my tweets." This is regular, and I didn't find this. I was wondering why it took so long actually. So this is the type of environment that we have been going through. Yes, some of us are still able to speak up at the expense of, facing or paying high prices for it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you for giving me this chance. I personally would like to express once again: no books are dangerous in no condition. No journalist. Journalism is not a crime. No journalist should be detained or arrested due to their journalistic activities.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so I think our panel has done a really good job of summarizing the situation. Thank you.
Akarçeşme, recently Gülen movement has begun to portray itself as a fierce defender of press freedom in Turkey. But the very same movement is conducting a smear campaign against, as I have taken a stance in social media against conversion of Hagia Sophia to a mosque. As everyone should be aware that accusing someone of insulting Islam is a big deal in Turkey that can put someone's life in danger. So
do not have enough time to pay attention to this other sort of smaller debates. To be honest, I'm not aware of it. But Zaman Media Group is composed of Zaman Daily, Today's Zaman, Cihan News Network, and Aksiyon magazine. So there is no affiliation between that news portal and your question. So I think it's very irrelevant to my position.
They're all affiliated with Gülen movement, as you know. So
How
the
do you know?
website is affiliated with Gülen movement as well.
Okay, if you argue that, I could easily argue that your newspaper is directly affiliated with President Erdogan because his son-in-law controls it.
Yeah, but
I mean,
that's not about
there is
me.
always some
It's
speculations.
about me, you know. You
Don't-
can just type my name in the like the five place in the Google. You can see that my name in this website.
Okay, I'm sorry if you are targeted by anyone, like any other colleague. I would not like any fellow journalist to be targeted, to be subject of smear campaigns, and I am not responsible for your targeting because, as I told you, this is the first time that I'm hearing about this news media portal, and as far as I know, our media group has no such news portal. What else can I say?
Okay, I think that about covers it. How about the gentleman in the back?
So, if a student, a young student, is not trying to understand, for example, the right of a publishing company to use a mocking cartoon of Prophet Muhammad, I mean, you are insulting me and you cannot do that, you have to limit. I mean, this is the decision that the publisher should take. And this is my limit for the press freedom, but she doesn't believe that limit. So that's the problem. I mean, and it will never end. And maybe the universal values will be depend on the society. I don't know. This is a very complicated the question. Maybe.
I would like to.
By the way, I don't agree this attack.
I'm sure you
understand
don't.
me, please.
But I have some legal aspects that maybe could be interesting because this is the question which come back all the time. Don't you think there's a limit for freedom of speech? And again, I refer to the text. And to give you also, it's not a universal answer because, by example, the situation in France and in the US is very different, and in many other countries. So there's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and many other declarations who really defend and guaranteed freedom of speech. And then at different states level, you have different understanding. And actually in France, there's a pretty regulated and restrictive freedom of speech, even if it's not maybe what we see. But by example, the two main limits of free speech in France are defamation and insults. And in this legal framework, Charlie Hebdo, by example, has been sued on average twice a year since it exists. And it has lost and it has won many cases. And it's in this same legal framework that today a so-called humorist is sued for praising terrorism. And in the US, by example, the contrary, you have a very extensive understanding of free speech, of freedom of the press, defended by the First Amendment. The only restriction is that it's forbidden to call for direct and imminent violence, if I'm right.
Even defamation is free.
Yes.
Well,
So-
yeah, well, you can't libel somebody, but it's very hard to prove.
So in a sense, it's a very broader understanding of freedom of speech. And the system in France is not perfect. The system in the US is not perfect. I don't know any perfect system. But what I have seen is that in many countries, we also use this defamation and insult regulation to restrict freedom of the press. And I can think, of course, of the case of the Saudi blogger, Raif Badawi, who is sentenced to 1,000 lashes for insulting Islam. But there's blasphemy law, which are considered really restrictive on freedom of speech in more than 30 countries right now. So I'm not saying that the French system is doing these laws in a balanced way, but what we see is that many countries are using this regulation in a very restrictive way. And then in the context of an absolute freedom, in a sense like in the US, when the legal framework gives huge freedom, you've seen that each newspaper will choose their own ethics standards. That's what we have seen in the US. That's why the New York Times didn't publish the cartoons and why the Washington Post published the cartoons. And I think we are talking about a real freedom of press when it's the media themselves who are smart enough to and have the freedom to choose what they want to publish or not. So I hope that would be a good answer to your question. What could be the limit of freedom of speech? It would be the freedom of speech
The
itself.
question to our politicians could adapt as well. He said, as media, your job is to humble me. So this is the role of media. I mean, without this might sound kind of a cliche, but when the media is silenced, you know, a society becomes deaf and blind, unfortunately. And who's going to determine these limits? I mean, this is a very tricky issue, and thanks to the freedom of expression, that has pretty much no limits that you are able to ask this question. If we begin to limit freedom of expression, where are we going to stop? And of course, you know, as a Muslim who is trying to be a practicing Muslim as much as I can, of course, Prophet Muhammad is dear to me. He is my role model as a Muslim in the world, and I am hurt by any insult against him. But on the other hand, I just think that I also unconditionally condemn any attack that was conducted in the name of Islam. So I think it should not be difficult for us as Muslims to demand freedom of expression, to respect freedom of expression, and sort of expect respect for sacred. But one point we miss in our Turkish political culture, I think, this is my personal opinion, of course. Yes, we have our sacred values, but we cannot expect everyone to have the same sacred, people, sacred values, etc. So this is my 2 cents.
Thank you. Yes.
So what is your comment?
So it's my job every day to push the U.S. administration and the U.S. Congress to speak up on press freedom violation, which happens in U.S. allies countries. And there's a lot of work to do, but I can tell you that we keep updated the State Department, the Congress on every incident we report on, and we need help to continue to do so to be more effective. But yes, the U.S. has to speak up more when there's such a violation in their own presence. Yeah.
One question, if I may, to Sevgi. She actually came out with a very important claim, but I want her to elaborate a little bit more on that, or any other panelists who are interested in elaborating on that. She claimed that Mr. Erdogan is the largest media boss in Turkey, directly or indirectly. We know how he deals with the opposition press, critical press, how he represses. But I think we need to learn a little bit more how he deals with the friendly press, how he makes sure the press is friendly. How does the mechanism work? You said there's like a pool system. What do you mean by that?
Actually, this might come sort of be a sweet life to be an Erdogan loyalist, especially in the media today under current environment, because you get to travel on the private plane of Erdogan. In addition to your column or space in your newspaper, for a government newspaper, you get to have your own TV show, for example, in state-controlled TV, TRT. So you hold multiple, positions at the same time, and in return you are making much more than an average journalist in Turkey. And for those of you who are not familiar with the media system in Turkey, unfortunately, reporters, correspondents are not actually doing good in terms of their salaries. Yes, some sort of star celebrities, columnists might be doing better, even though some of them really famous ones have lost their jobs during the process. But unfortunately, probably I sometimes wonder why they still, despite everything, they support this government in the face of open, clear, well-documented corruption, unlawful actions, erosion in separation of powers, judicial independence, crackdown on media. Why are they, supporting crackdown against fellow journalists?
But does Erdogan own those newspapers?
No, he is not. Of course, I mean some of them, as we know, are owned by his son-in-law. But the others, he has established a system slowly. Well, I try to understand his logic, because we have to remember that Erdogan was an underdog for a long time. He has suffered from the discrimination of the Kemalist, or authoritarian ideology in Turkey, because I remember when he was banned from politics, a major mainstream media outlet ran a headline. He cannot even become a village chief. So if I was Erdogan reading the major newspaper in Turkey, sort of fighting a war against me, even when I was banned from politics, I guess in his thinking, he might have promised himself to control media whenever he has the power. And he always says that, I came to this point, we came to this point by fighting against headlines. This is a remark that he has been repeating over years, and for a while, I just thought that it was just a reaction. But later on, after those audio leaks, phone conversations that were leaked on the internet that proved direct control of Erdogan, in one of which tapes, for example, he calls the owner of Daily Milliyet, one of the mainstream newspapers that has a long tradition in Turkey. He openly reprimands the owner of the newspaper, who is a 80 years old something conglomerate industrialist in Turkey, and he literally cries. Erdogan lashes out at him for publishing the minutes of the settlement process between the PKK and the government. He directly interferes in the editorial policy of the newspaper, and instead of speaking up against Erdogan, he literally cries. So even though he is the media boss on paper, he owns the media, but unfortunately, Erdogan has indirect control, and this has become a pattern. In return for, as I told earlier, in return for lucrative state tenders, businessmen contribute or sort of donate, forced donations, donate to this pool system in which the government establishes or controls media outlets that would only serve its own interests.
Okay, we only have a couple more minutes. This young lady has been clamoring for a
Yes,
question.
thank you. Friction between the Turkish government and the Gülen movement. And is it because the Gülen movement initiated another movement which released premature confidential government information by hacking into government databases? So shouldn't people who engage in conspiracy against their own government face consequences? And thank you.
That question was for Tolga, right?
Oh, I'm sorry,
Delphine.
the comment was for Tolga, and the question is actually towards safety.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
Go for it.
Yes, anyone who acts unlawfully within the government, in their government jobs, in their positions, who abuse their positions, should be tried and persecuted as long as there is concrete evidence proving it in front of independent judiciary. And I guess from your question, directing, because you are directing me, I assume that you are holding me responsible for those sort of, or army, the group responsible for those leaks. I don't know the source of those leaks, but without them, I guess we would not have learned the instructions, direct instructions that Erdogan gave. But by the way, most of them are legally authorized tappings that were part of the corruption investigation in Turkey. As for the others, I don't know the sources of them, but as a Turkish citizen, concerned Turkish citizen in the first place, let alone my identity, as part of the Zaman media group, I am glad to have learned the instructions, direct instructions of Erdogan, telling newspaper owners what to publish, what not to publish, instructing TV stations what to run as a subtitle or not. So.
And we learn from Gülen also. He is instructing what they publish, what they not.
How do you know?
Because of these tapes.
What?
These tapes.
What tape?
That you are mentioned.
You never know? You never watch it?
No, what I told me. Go ahead and form your question.
Yeah.
Is it the YouTube?
Okay, the simple question. Is anyone can criticize
Yes.
Gülen in Zaman group? That's simple question. By the way, I would like to thank you, Tolga. Really, I support your...
Can you identify
video.
yourself?
Yeah, my name is Murat Berk. I'm also Turkish American and the president of Turkish American Cultural Society.
Okay.
Just a simple question: is anyone can really criticize Gulen in
Is
Zaman
Gulen-
group?
is Gulen
And
the problem?
let me finish.
your
And
boss.
thank you very much for real
Yes, he's your
freedom
boss.
of expression.
You talking for
I
him,
really
right?
like your comments, but at the same time, I feel I
This is the type of
Just please,
harassment-
hold on. Excuse me. Just finish your question and then that's it.
Yeah, that's okay. And the very basic thing, and Mr. Raghup, he told us that he gets some threat from the Twitter or whatever he said. Can you support him? You are a journalist. Can you write a letter, or the columnist? Can you support him? That's just in front of you. Just you don't need to go to Turkey. He's here. Let's support each other. As a journalist.
Okay,
Thank you.
got it. Thank you.
We can take a big question.
Yeah. Okay, this gentleman. And this will be the last question.
Thank you. The church. So much of the church became just a rubber stamp of the new National Socialist ideology. But there were those who protested, stood up and really protested also. My question is, in Turkey now, are there those in the Muslim community, in the leadership? I realize that the imams are paid by the state and that sermons are edited by the state, but are there those who are willing now to stand up with courage and make a protest against the present direction? Except for the Gulen movement.
But these are valid questions, and unfortunately in Turkey we're going through a period where, as a function of government policies, that space of freedom has narrowed down, and there is the risk that it may continue to narrow. And then, Paul, and to Murat too, there is the Turkish political, cultural dimension to it too. We have been a country, and I've been around now for an embarrassingly long time. Today I was telling somebody that my first political instance, Anstane, was in Izmir, this inzibat gendarmes standing there because there had just been a coup. This is my first. And it feels like all these years have gone by, and we arpa boyu gittik. We didn't go very far. And this is precisely for the question you and Paul have asked. Unfortunately, we're in a country where there are limits to the kind of questions that you can ask. And what I am saying is that the more those limits broaden, the more difficult it will be for Turkey to reach the very objectives and targets that this government has put forward. And it's very ironic that it is also this government or this political party that gave someone like me a taste of what liberal democracy could be in a country like Turkey.
All right, we are past time. I'm going to make this the last question.
Okay, very sure.
Thank you. I'm an independent journalist, and I write I tweet or I write on the Facebook, and I have pretty much followers. Anyhow, my question is: you are saying is our president have a private airplane?
What's your
What's
name?
your name?
My name is Şükriye Yıldırım.
Şükriye Yıldırım. Yeah, you are saying is our president has a private plane. I mean, usually all the presidents has to have a private airplane. Anyhow, my question is, my question is, Fethullah Gülen has a TV station and newspaper, has a big power on it, and you saying our president too. Where he is, like Fethullah Gülen is, where he's getting all this power, and when he is just the only imam. And other thing is media actually is just a business, and
You can say independent media because you make money with the media and you reach out to people because you want to do your, you want to give the message to people in the world, and media is a big, huge power. We all know that. And I do use the same thing too, and I like that.
Okay, get to your question, please.
Yeah, I was just wondering, what's your comment on all these? You know, the one I'm explaining. What is your comment?
There's no question.
I want to learn, what's all your comments? Why he's getting all this power, Fethullah Gülen?
I don't know, you have to ask, Erdogan why he's targeting and blaming him as the sort of the power behind everything that he's not able to explain in Turkey, using him as a scapegoat and this convenient tool that is created in the name of...
My question,
Go ahead. Of course, to people or in a media structure in which people receive direct instructions from Erdogan, it's hard to make people believe that I am an independent journalist in Zaman Media Group, and I have not received any single instruction, Fethullah Gülen, from my editor-in-chief Bülent Keneş at today's Zaman and Ekrem Dumanlı in Zaman. You could, if you do not take my word, you could ask people who chose to quit and leave Zaman, the columnists who chose to switch to pro-government media outlets. Another thing, media power, yes. Our media outlets, yes, it is true that we are inspired by the teachings of peaceful Islamic scholar Fethullah Gülen, who has been promoting education, peaceful coexistence of people, people from different walks of life, and interfaith dialogue, and I don't mind being inspired by his teachings.
Okay, we'll have to make that the last word, and you all can continue the discussion afterwards.
Thank you.
I just want to leave us with the hope that whatever discussion we have, we can keep it civilized and love one another. Okay? Thank you very much.
Very prominent journalists of high standing and long standing have been victims of this ostracization. And I feel deeply, deeply concerned about this because the current government has on numerous occasions set a very high target for Turkey to become the 10th largest economy in the world by 2023, when the Republic's centenary will be celebrated. And I can't help wonder how we're going to get there if critical thinking is silenced.
Delphine Halgan with Reporters Without Borders. Tell us a little bit about how they see the situation in Turkey.
So just to finish on your last comment that I have to say I agree on, I just want, it's obvious to me that I'm afraid that Fox News in the US has a huge market and can make huge mistakes when reporting on France. So I just had to make this heuristic. I just wanted maybe to make three different comments on three different aspects of this crackdown. So first, the one that we already mentioned, the internet censorship, which is becoming more and more important with more and more legal attempts to legalize the fact that the authorities can block website without court decision. There's actually a judicial fight going on between the Constitutional Court and the Parliament. But
I suspect and I speculate that these two young ladies will eventually be let go. But in early this month, the Hürriyet newspaper ran the results of a public opinion survey that included 16,000 people. And one of the many questions that was asked was whether you considered that the media and the internet could be censored. And I'm afraid 60% said the media could be censored, and 61% said that the internet could be censored. So we are facing, unfortunately, a society that, in spite of Turkey setting out on the road of democracy in 1946, we have not arrived to the point where Hassan Salame would like us to be in. Last point I would like to make is that also as an observer of Turkish politics for the period I've made references to, I must also recognize that today when you survey to the Turkish media, there is a lot of critical opinion out there. And some of it is penned in a manner, if I was targeted, I would take offense of it. But the pool of those people are very quickly shrinking, as many face this harassment or end up being ostracized. Some
Yes. In 2014, Reporters Without Borders documented 117 incidents of attacks and threats against journalists in Turkey. In 2012 and 2013, the Erdogan government had more journalists imprisoned than any other country in the world, more than China, more than Iran. In 2013, we at the National Press Club gave our annual Press Freedom Award to one of those jailed journalists, Zeynep Kure of the Istanbul Daily Burgun. Now, there aren't as many reporters in jail this year in Turkey, but there are too many reporters in jail in Turkey. As recently as mid-December, the government of President Erdogan ordered the arrest of more than 31 people, including a large number of journalists and senior managers affiliated with media outlets supportive of Erdogan's rival, the US-based Islamic cleric Fethullah Gulen. Turkey also censors social media. It shut down Twitter for a couple of weeks last year. Twitter has agreed to block access in Turkey to many accounts and tweets, although those are available outside of Turkey. And just yesterday we learned that Facebook agreed to block a page in Turkey that the government said was critical of the Prophet Muhammad. Turkey's Prime Minister said in the Washington Post in an interview published on Sunday that there is no right to insult Islam. No one here wants to insult Islam, but we defend the right of news organizations to determine what's in poor taste and what's insulting, because we believe. Welcome everybody. I guess we'll go ahead and get started on time. And my name is John Donnelly, and I'm a reporter for Congressional Quarterly, cover defense issues, and I'm the chairman of the National Press Club Press Freedom Committee. And I'd like to welcome you to the National Press Club, the world's leading professional organization for journalists. The Press Freedom Committee of the Press Club spearheads the club's efforts to speak out for press freedom and transparency and to speak against repression of the media wherever it occurs. And I emphasize that because I've seen a few suggestions on Twitter in the last few days, just as I tried to promote this event, that somehow tonight's event is picking on Turkey and exempting from criticism the United States or Israel. In fact, Turkish President Erdogan criticized Reporters Without Borders on similar grounds last year. Baseless. We at the National Press Club don't play favorites. We target America's shortcomings too. And you can see for yourself by going to our website, press.org, and looking at our Press Freedom page. A member of NATO and ostensibly a democracy, but it has a bad track record in human rights. And when it comes to press freedom, independent monitors, such as the Reporters Without Borders and the Committee to Protect Journalists, say Turkey has been getting worse in recent years. The Reporters Without Borders ranked Turkey number 154 out of 180 countries in its 2014 Press Freedom Index. That when governments are allowed to make those decisions for newspapers, it's easier for governments to repress all kinds of expression.
I would like to refer to only two cases, and I think they are very sad cases. One of them involves a young lady called Sedef Kabash, who happens to have been a student of mine, a very bright media person who studied here in the US too, worked for CNN here, and then subsequently in Turkey. And now she's under an investigation for a Twitter she has sent out about the prosecutor that concluded there was no case as far as the corruption allegations involving some of the political leadership. The second example is Merve Büyüksaraç. This is really a sadder case because this is Miss Turkey. And Miss Turkey happened to come across a poem that takes a satirical perspective on the Turkish national anthem and the president of Turkey. And when she was warned by a friend of hers that this could cause her trouble, she immediately withdrew. But that was too late, and she was detained, and I understand subsequently freed.